Welcome back everybody and welcome aboard another episode of Steady As She Goes. As we mentioned last week, we've now broken through the 1000 streams and downloads milestone, so a big thank you to everyone who has been listening, sharing and supporting the podcast. We also added in a short extra podcast again this week as part of our Harbour Stories series, looking at the fascinating history of the Flettner rotor sails and how that unusual technology harnesses wind power at sea. It was another busy week as well at the Rosslare Harbour Maritime Heritage Centre. We were delighted to welcome a pre-arranged visit from the newly reformed 6th Wexford Sea Scout Group. The Scouts had a great visit to the centre and also visited the nearby Commissioners of Irish Light's helicopter pad. It's fantastic to see the Sea Scouts back up and running again in Rosslare Harbour, and we look forward to welcoming them back again in the near future. Well done to all concerned. Coming up on episode 13 of Steady As She Goes, we've a busy roundup of maritime news from around the coast with plenty of activity on our shores. We'll be looking back to the sinking of the Foxwell in the early 1800s. Marine insurance is very much in the spotlight at the moment, and we'll take our own look at how that world works. We'll also reflect on the early days of maritime communication and how news of ships once travelled across the seas. And as always, we'll have our maritime words of the week. Very welcome aboard. Now let's take a look at some of the latest maritime news and stories from around the coast. We have an update on the proposed Cork to Boulogne ferry service. Now, listeners may remember that quite a few weeks ago here on Steady As She Goes, we spoke about the possibility of a new ferry service linking Cork with Boulogne in northern France. At that time we mentioned that the proposed operator was expected to be called Hibernia Line, and that it could potentially provide another direct maritime link between Ireland and mainland Europe, particularly for freight traffic. Well, there's been a bit of an update on that story, and according to a recent report in the Irish Independent, Laurence Goodman, the son of well-known Irish businessman Larry Goodman, is understood to be establishing an interest in Hibernia Line, the company associated with that proposed ferry route. It's still very much early days, but the project has attracted attention because of its potential to create another direct sea connection between Ireland and continental Europe, particularly for freight and export traffic. So it's certainly one we'll keep an eye on here on Steady As She Goes, and we'll bring you further updates as the story develops. Now, Brittany Ferries are in the news with their charter of the MV Norbay for the Rosslare Cherbourg service, which begins on the 23rd of March. And Brittany Ferries have confirmed that they will charter that vessel to strengthen its Rosslare to Cherbourg service. The ship will begin operating, as I say, on the route from the 23rd of March under a 1-year time charter from P&O Ferries, with an option to extend for a second year. The addition of Norbay will allow Brittany Ferries to maintain 7 sailings a week between Rosslare and Cherbourg, providing greater capacity and reliability for freight operators moving goods between Ireland and mainland Europe. The vessel itself, of course, dates back to 1994, measuring around 167 metres in length and offering more than 2,000 lane metres of freight capacity, along with basic onboard accommodation for truck drivers. The move reflects the continued importance of direct ferry links between Ireland and continental Europe, particularly since Brexit, with many freight operators now choosing routes that bypass the traditional UK land bridge. Years ago, ferry companies generally stayed within their own lanes and rarely operated with one another's ships, but today chartering vessels between operators has become far more common, giving companies the flexibility to respond quickly to changes in demand and keep key routes running smoothly. There's been an unusual visitor to the Rosslare area recently, with the ferry Côte d'Alberteur stepping in to cover sailings to the Rosslare to Dunkirk route. Apologies for the pronunciation there. And this is while the DFDS vessel Athena Seaways undergoes her refit period. The substitution means that passengers and freight travelling between Ireland and northern France may notice a ship that normally operates elsewhere. The Côte d'Alberteur is usually deployed on the Newhaven to Dieppe service across the English Channel, operating under the Transmanche Ferries brand. Because of that arrangement, the ship is arriving into Rosslare still wearing her distinctive Transmanche Ferries livery, which is a bright yellow colour, of course, and makes her very easy to distinguish in and around the port. While she may be a fresh sight for many people locally, this isn't the vessel's first call to Rosslare. Her last sailing out of the port was on March 25th, 2025, although she still remains a relatively unusual visitor to Irish shores. During the time that the Athena Seaways is away undergoing scheduled maintenance, Côte has been drafted in to help maintain the Rosslare to Dunkirk service, ensuring the route continues to operate with minimal disruption. And taken together with the recent charter of Norbay onto the Rosslare Cherbourg route, it certainly gives our men on watch something a little different to look out for in the ever-changing maritime landscape of Ireland's southeast coast. For now, at least, Côte is a welcome visitor to Rosslare, and we wish the ship and her crew all the very best for the time she is serving on the route. And I suppose it just really shows the importance of that route now to these operators, that they're not leaving gaps. If vessels are going away for refit, they're replacing them with the tonnage that they can find around Europe, and as I say, not leaving any gaps, and providing that freight service there for the drop trailers and the running units that are running down to Northern Europe. And of course, again, it brings up the question of why Stena Line, of course, pulled out of the route. Having operated 2 ships down to Cherbourg, they pulled out completely, and Brittany Ferries, DFDS, etc. are continuing to do very well on those routes. Now, a new book on the E-Flexor ferry series. So this book, focusing on one of the most important modern ferry designs, has just been published. Released on the 6th of March by Ferry Publications, the book is titled Stena E-Flexor Series, Versatile Ferries for the 21st Century. The E-Flexor class has quickly become one of the most successful modern ferry designs in operation today. Developed by Stena Roro, the concept was created as a flexible platform that could be adapted for different operators and routes across Europe. Rather than designing a completely new ship each time, the E-Flexor concept uses a standardized hull and machinery layout which can then be customized depending on the needs of the ferry operator, whether that means more freight space, greater passenger capacity, or alternative propulsion systems. Since the very first vessels entered service in 2020, the ships have appeared across a number of major ferry networks operating for companies including Stena Line themselves, Brittany Ferries, DFDS, and several more vessels either recently delivered or currently under construction. The new publication runs to around 160 pages and includes a detailed look at the development of the E-Flexor concept, as well as individual profiles of the ships already in service and those still on order. The book also explores related vessel designs developed by Stena Roro in recent years. For ferry enthusiasts and maritime followers, it offers comprehensive overview of a class of vessel that has quickly become a familiar sight on many European routes, including several services close to home here on the Irish Sea. And it's just another reminder of just how quickly ferry design continues to evolve, as operators look for ships that are more efficient, more flexible, and increasingly environmentally friendly. Now, our good friend Terry Conlon keeps a good check-in with us here at the Maritime Centre in Rosslare, and of course through the podcast, and he's brought us some interesting news this week. According to Terry, Irish Continental Group has now confirmed that it owns 8 ferries and 9 container ships, which is quite a significant fleet when you think about the scale of Irish shipping today. But the real point of interest from Terry is one particular Irish flagged vessel currently trading far from home. The Arklow Spirit is presently bound for Manaus, which lies roughly 1,000 miles up the Amazon River, having sailed from San Lorenzo in South America. Fascinating voyage when you think about it, a geared bulk carrier sailing deep into the Amazon basin under the Irish flag. Now, the Arklow Spirit, registered most importantly in Arklow, has been operating in South American trades for some time now, but it's still fantastic to see an Irish registered vessel working routes like this. It really reminds us that Irish ships continue to trade all over the world. We'll certainly keep an eye on the progress of the Arklow Spirit and see how long she remains in that part of the world and how the voyage plans develop. It does make you wonder how many Irish seafarers over the years would have visited the same Manaus or indeed San Lorenzo, and trips to South America were always greeted with a smile among seafarers. I remember trading down to Brazil myself for iron ore, and they were always memorable voyages, great places to go ashore, and a very different part of the world. So it's wonderful to see the Arklow Spirit retracing some of the steps of Irish ships from long ago. And of course, our thanks again to Terry Conlon for bringing that bit of news to our attention. And while I mentioned Terry, it's a good moment to remind listeners and readers about his excellent book, Irish Merchant Ships and Ship Owners, an outline history of powered ships from the beginning of steam navigation, the Irish Mercantile Marine, 1815 to 2015. It's still available here at the Maritime Heritage Centre in Rosslare Harbour. You can also get a copy through our Facebook page or simply drop us a line. It's a fantastic publication and really a must-have for anyone interested in Irish shipping or indeed merchant shipping anywhere in the world. Now to the opening of a new Coast Guard station, and the new Irish Coast Guard station at Westport was opened on 7th of March by Minister Kenny, a significant development for maritime safety along Ireland's west coast, with the official opening of the new Irish Coast Guard station in Westport, County Mayo. The facility was, of course, formally opened by Sean Kenny, Minister of State with special responsibility for the Irish Coast Guard, alongside Minister of State for the Office of Public Works, Kevin Boxer-Moran. The purpose-built station, costing approximately €6.8 million, represents a major investment in Ireland's national search and rescue infrastructure and in the volunteers who provide that service along the Mayo coastline. The new two-storey building provides modern operational space for the Westport Coast Guard unit, including offices, a training room, equipment stores, changing facilities and dedicated storage areas for rescue vehicles and boats. The building also includes welfare facilities such as a drying room and kitchenette, helping support crews who often return from call-outs in very challenging conditions. The Westport unit itself is made up of 28 volunteer members, providing round-the-clock land and water-based search and rescue coverage along a large stretch of coastline from Killary Harbour to Mulranny. Speaking at the opening, Minister Kenny paid tribute to the volunteers who respond to emergencies in difficult weather and challenging terrain, and he noted that the new station will significantly strengthen the unit's operational capability. The station also supports the wider network of emergency services operating in the region, including, of course, the RNLI, Mayo Mountain Rescue, Civil Defence Ireland and the Search and Rescue Dog Association Ireland, who often work together during incidents along Ireland's Atlantic coast. For the Westport Coast Guard team, the new facility marks an important step forward, providing modern equipment, improved training space and better welfare conditions for the volunteers who stand ready to respond whenever they are needed. And for the communities of Clew Bay and the wider Mayo coastline, it represents a continued investment in safety along one of Ireland's most dramatic and challenging stretches of coast. Now, after more than 6 decades of service on one of Britain's most famous waterways, the ferry Royal Iris of the Mersey is preparing to sail for the final time on the River Mersey. The much-loved vessel has been a familiar sight on the Liverpool waterfront for generations, carrying commuters, tourists and day trippers across the river while also operating popular sightseeing cruises along the Mersey. As the ferry approaches the end of her service, visitors are being invited aboard during the month of March to share memories, photographs and stories from their time travelling on the ship. The farewell events are expected to attract large numbers of people keen to say goodbye to a vessel that has become part of the region's maritime identity. Originally launched in 1959, the vessel began her career under the name Mountwood before later being renamed Royal Iris of the Mersey, following a major refurbishment in 2001. Over the decades, she has carried hundreds of thousands of passengers each year, becoming one of the best-known ferries on the river. Her retirement marks the end of an era for the Mersey ferry fleet as preparations continue for the arrival of a new vessel, Royal Daffodil, which will be the very first new ferry built for the river in more than 60 years. But before that new chapter begins, the spotlight remains firmly on the Royal Iris of the Mersey. For many people across Liverpool and the world, she represents far more than just a ferry. Generations of families have travelled aboard her on school trips and summer excursions and simple crossings of that famous river. So over the coming weeks, passengers will have one final opportunity to step aboard, take a few photographs and perhaps share a story or two about their own journey on one of the most recognisable ships ever to sail the river. Now, Recently at the Maritime Centre here in Rosslare Harbour, a small plaque came to my attention which records an extraordinary endurance feat that took place in June of 1985. At first glance it seems simple enough, a list of names, a boat and a time. But the story it hints at is anything but ordinary. The plaque records a rowing boat named Lady Anne, completing what is described as the first rowing crossing of the Irish Sea, between Rosslare Harbour in County Wexford of course, and the small Welsh harbour of Solva in Pembrokeshire. That journey is no small undertaking. From Rosslare on the southeastern tip of Ireland to Solva on the Welsh coast is roughly 50 nautical miles across St George's Channel. Open sea known for strong tides, the Atlantic swell and changeable weather conditions. Today of course ferries make the crossing in a few hours, but in June 1985 5 people set out to make the journey the hard way, by oar. According to the plaque, the crew consisted of M. Jouncey, N. Childs and J. Layton, with D. Fletcher and D. Bowie also aboard as stroke and coxswain. Their vessel was the Lady Anne, almost certainly a coastal rowing boat built for endurance rather than speed. The crew departed Rosslare on the 13th of June 1985 and rowed across St George's Channel for 15 hours and 20 minutes no less. That's an extraordinary physical effort. Hour after hour, stroke after stroke, the crew would have battled fatigue while tides and currents tried to push them off course. Careful navigation would have been essential to keep them on track for the Welsh coast. Eventually, the coastline of Pembrokeshire would have appeared ahead of them, and their destination, the small harbour of Solva, tucked into a narrow inlet on the north side of St Bride's Bay. When the Lady Anne finally arrived, the crew had completed a remarkable open sea rowing crossing. For many years the story seems to have slipped quietly into obscurity, but recently a small piece of the puzzle emerged. Now, thanks to Paul Byrne, who commented on a Facebook post that I put up, we now know the voyage was reported at the time. Paul shared a photograph from an article in the Western Daily Press, which is dated Monday the 17th of June 1985, which shows the boat and the crew during their crossing. One detail in the photograph is particularly striking. The rowers are certainly not dressed in the kind of high performance gear we'd expect today. No technical sportswear or specialised rowing kit, just ordinary clothing and practical layers. A reminder that this was a very different era. And yet, beyond that photograph and the plaque itself, much of the story still remains untold. Somewhere out there are people who remember the crossing, perhaps the rowers themselves, perhaps people who stood on the quay at Solva and watched a tired crew bring their boat ashore after 15 hours at sea. So if you recognise any of the names or know anything more about the voyage of the Lady Anne, we'd love to hear from you, because sometimes the best maritime stories are the ones waiting to be rediscovered, and this one may just be hiding in plain sight. Now this week marks the anniversary of one of the darkest moments in modern maritime history, the loss of the ferry Herald of Free Enterprise. On the evening of the 6th of March 1987, the roll-on roll-off ferry departed the Belgian port of Zeebrugge, bound for Dover. Just minutes after leaving harbour, with the ship still in shallow enough water, tragedy struck. The vessel had sailed with her bow doors open. As she gathered speed, sea water rushed onto the vehicle deck. Within moments, the ferry lost stability, rolled onto her side and partially capsized in the harbour approaches. In the freezing waters of the North Sea that night, 193 passengers and crew lost their lives. The disaster shocked the maritime world. The official inquiry later found a combination of human error and systematic failures within the company involved, and it exposed serious weaknesses in safety procedures aboard roll-on roll-off ferries at the time. Now, in the years that followed, the tragedy led to major changes across the international ferry industry. New regulations were introduced, including improved bridge procedures, better communication between deck and bridge crews, bow door indicator systems, enhanced watertight safety measures, and much stricter stability requirements for ferries. As a result of those reforms, ferry travel today is significantly safer and far more stringently regulated than it was at the time of the disaster, with international standards designed to prevent a tragedy like this from ever happening again. Here on the podcast, we also shared a remembrance post across our social media channels this week, marking the anniversary and reflecting on the people who lost their lives. The loss of the Herald of Free Enterprise remains one of the most significant tragedies in modern maritime history, not only because of the scale of the loss, but because it forced the industry to confront serious weaknesses in safety culture and operational procedures. This week, we remember the 193 passengers and crew who died and reflect on lessons learned from that terrible night in 1987. The memory continues to shape the safety standards that protect passengers and crews across the ferry industry today. Aresh Day, go raibh Hanamacha Dealish. Now, in an earlier episode, we spoke with Captain John Riley about one of the enduring mysteries of maritime history, the disappearance of the SS Naronic. The vessel, operated by the famous White Star Line, departed Liverpool in February 1893, bound for New York, carrying a cargo of livestock and general goods. Not long after leaving port, the ship vanished somewhere in the North Atlantic. No distress signal was ever received, no confirmed wreckage was recovered, and tragically all 74 crew members on board were lost. What followed was one of the great unsolved mysteries of the shipping world. A small number of messages and bottles were later reported as having been found along the Atlantic coast, supposedly written by crew members in the ship's final moments, although their authenticity has long been debated. Over the years, many theories have been suggested to explain what might have happened. Some believe the vessel may have been overwhelmed by a sudden winter storm, while others have suggested structural failure or a catastrophic cargo shift. But with no wreck ever discovered, the fate of the ship remains unknown. The story of the Naronic continues to fascinate maritime historians to this day, and a new documentary exploring the mystery has recently been produced by a man called Daniel Harrison, examining the history of the ship and the many theories surrounding her disappearance. The documentary is available to watch on YouTube, and we'll also be sharing it across the podcast social media channels for anyone who would like to take a look and a deeper delve into this remarkable and still unsolved maritime mystery. At the beginning of the 20th century, ships at sea were effectively cut off from the world. Once a vessel disappeared over the horizon, there was no way of knowing her progress until she arrived safely in port. But in 1901, on a quiet stretch of coast at Rosslare in County Wexford, a tall mast rose above the fields, and with it began a revolution in maritime communication. Now, this story came to us through one of our own crew members here on Steady As She Goes, Robert McFadden, who you may remember joined us on a previous episode to talk about his time working as a radio officer at sea. And Robert recently passed on a fascinating extract from the Radio Officers Association newsletter shared with him by a friend, telling the story of the Rosslare wireless station and the remarkable role it played in the early days of communication at sea. The station at Rosslare was part of an ambitious experiment led by the pioneering wireless inventor Guglielmo Marconi. Marconi believed ships at sea could remain in contact with land using wireless signals, and in 1901 a network of coastal stations began to appear along the south coast of Ireland. Rosslare was chosen as one of those sites. The station was built just outside the village on Strand Road. In May of that year, a mast nearly 180 feet high was erected in 3 sections supported by 8 steel stays. Locals said that from a distance it looked like the topmast of a ship standing alone on the land. Beside it stood a modest 2-storey house. Downstairs was the wireless room, along with the kitchen and living space. Upstairs were the bedrooms for the operators, who would work long watches listening for signals from ships passing out in the Irish Sea. The station itself was linked by landline to the nearby post office, which meant that messages received by wireless could immediately be forwarded into the National Telegraph System. But the real test of this new technology came at sea. In May 1901, the Beaver Line passenger steamer SS Lake Champlain sailed from Liverpool, bound for Halifax in Nova Scotia, with around 1,200 passengers on board. She carried something new, one of the earliest wireless telegraph sets installed on a merchant vessel. The equipment was crude by modern standards. The transmitter used a large induction coil powered by batteries, producing a spark that jumped between metal contacts. Each spark created bursts of radio energy that carried Morse code signals through the air. The receiving equipment was equally primitive, a device called a coherer, which detected radio waves and recorded the incoming Morse code signals onto a moving paper tape. There were no tuning circuits, no precise controls, and no guarantee that the system would work reliably over long distances. But as the Lake Champlain steamed down the Irish Sea, the experiment began to prove itself. When the ship was about 13 miles off Holyhead in Wales, the wireless operator established contact with a shore station for the first time. Shortly afterwards, signals were exchanged with Rosslare. Passengers quickly realised the possibilities. Telegrams were written and handed to the wireless operator, who tapped them out in Morse code across the airwaves. For the very first time in history, people travelling across the Atlantic could send messages to friends and family while still at sea. When the ship passed Rosslare, the operators there received the signals and forwarded them by landline through the telegraph network. Communication continued until the vessel was about 30 miles beyond the Irish coast. The trial was considered a remarkable success. The following year, wireless technology took another dramatic step forward when Guglielmo Marconi succeeded in sending the first wireless signal across the Atlantic Ocean from Cornwall to Newfoundland. It proved that radio waves could travel far beyond the visible horizon, something many scientists had previously believed impossible. Soon, more and more ships began to carry wireless sets. At Rosslare, the small station became an increasingly busy link to this growing communications network. 6 operators worked there in rotating shifts. The day was divided into 3 watches, midnight to 8 in the morning, 8 to 4 in the afternoon, and 4 in the evening until midnight. 2 operators were required on each watch, constantly listening for signals from passing ships. At first, they might communicate with only one vessel at a time, but as wireless equipment spread through the merchant fleet, the traffic steadily increased. Rosslare also proved a pleasant posting for operators. The ferry route between Rosslare and Fishguard meant easy access to Wales, while a railway line connected the village to Dublin. Wexford town was just 10 miles away. In 1903, the Rosslare Hotel opened nearby, today known as Kelly's Hotel, and it quickly became a popular place for visitors and operators alike. But technology continued to advance rapidly. The Rosslare station had a limited operating range of only 30 to 40 miles offshore. As wireless equipment improved, more powerful coastal stations were required. Eventually, a new station was built across the Irish Sea at Fishguard, high on the cliffs above the harbour. Its new transmitters had a range of up to 500 miles, and with that development, Rosslare's role became redundant. At midnight on Monday the 8th of September 1913, the Rosslare wireless station closed. The operators were transferred to the new installation in Fishguard, and the Rosslare call sign, Golf Romeo Lima, went with them. Yet the story did not end there. The building that once housed the station still stands today, known as Marconi House, with a plaque marking the site where wireless communication first linked ships at sea with the Irish coast. The technology pioneered there would go on to transform maritime safety. For most of the 20th century, ships around the world relied on Morse code radio signals to communicate with coastal stations and to send distress calls when disaster struck. Those familiar dots and dashes continued to echo across the airwaves until the very end of the century, when the last commercial Morse code watchkeeping finally ceased at stations such as Portishead Radio. And today, long after the last Morse code signals faded from the airwaves, the quiet house at Rosslare still stands, a reminder of the moment when ships first learned to speak to the shore through the air. What a remarkable story when you think today of emails, text messages, WhatsApps, Snapchats, TikToks constantly flying through the air from all over the world, and when we think back to the very first messages being received down at Rosslare, It's absolutely fascinating, and thanks so much to Robert and his friend for bringing that story to our attention. I'm sure the listeners will find it as interesting as I do myself, because I think it's absolutely amazing that history, we're surrounded by it really, and we're so lucky to have those stories being retold. Now, last week on Steady As She Goes, we talked about the experience of seafarers during wartime, the men and women who continue to keep global trade moving even when tensions rise around them. This week, the headlines are once again full of stories about ships waiting, routes being reconsidered, and the rising cost of marine insurance. Behind those headlines sits an institution that has quietly shaped maritime trade for more than 3 centuries, the global insurance market at Lloyd's of London. Because when uncertainty grows at sea, the first question ship owners often ask is simply, can we sail? Is this a voyage that we can insure? And inside Lloyd's underwriting room hangs a bell that once announced the fate of ships around the world. When it rang once, the news was bad, a vessel lost. When it rang twice, the message was relief. A ship previously feared missing had arrived safely. For centuries, that bell symbolised the risks of the sea. Today, those risks are rising again, not from storms, but from geopolitics. The story of Lloyd's begins in the late 17th century in a coffee house run by Edward Lloyd. Ship owners, merchants and insurers gathered there to exchange shipping news and agree insurance for voyages across dangerous oceans. Over time, that informal meeting place evolved into the global insurance marketplace that still operates in London today. At the centre of Lloyd's maritime traditions is the famous Lutein bell. The bell came from the wreck of the HMS Lutein, a former French frigate captured by Britain and later lost in a storm on the 9th of October 1799 off the Dutch coast. The ship was carrying a cargo of gold and silver bullion bound for Hamburg when it went down on the sandbanks of the Wadden Sea. Lloyd's underwriters honoured the claim in full within weeks, a moment that helped cement the market's reputation for paying losses. For many years afterwards, the recovered bell from the wreck was used to announce major shipping news to the underwriting room. Today, the risks faced by shipping are no longer just wind and waves. The narrow waters of the Strait of Hormuz remain one of the most important maritime choke points in the world, carrying roughly 1/5 of global seaborne oil trade. But tensions in the Persian Gulf have once again put that route under pressure. Some tankers have slowed, diverted or waited outside the strait as ship owners assess the security situation. The issue is not just military risk, it is insurance. The calculus of risk within the Lloyd's market operates the Joint War Committee, a body that monitors global conflict zones and designates waters where shipping may face war-related dangers. When a region is added to the committee's list of high-risk areas, vessels entering those waters must obtain additional war risk insurance. Recently, the committee expanded the area considered high risk in the Gulf to include waters around Bahrain, Djibouti, Kuwait, Oman and Qatar. For ship owners, that decision does not stop ships sailing, but it can dramatically increase the cost of doing so. Faced with rising premiums and uncertainty, some vessels have chosen to pause. Oil tankers carrying millions of barrels of crude have remained outside the Strait of Hormuz, while insurers, reinsurers and ship owners reassess the situation. Others may still sail, but at a much higher cost. When the risk of loss increases, insurance premiums follow. And when the cost of transporting oil and gas rises, those increases ripple outward through global energy markets and eventually reach consumers, as we well know. There have also been suggestions that naval escorts could accompany commercial tankers through the strait. While that might reduce the immediate danger to individual vessels, insurers must also consider another possibility, that travelling alongside a warship could make a tanker an even more visible target. Even protection can change the calculation of risk. Now, Lloyd's has faced maritime crises many times in its long history. When the passenger liner RMS Titanic sank in the North Atlantic in 1912, underwriters at Lloyd's were among those who paid claims from the loss of the vessel and its cargo. Events like that helped shape the reputation of Lloyd's as the place where the maritime world confronts catastrophe. Thankfully, no tankers have been lost in the current tensions in the Gulf so far, but uncertainty alone is enough to disrupt global trade. From the underwriting desks of London to the narrow waters of the Middle East, the consequences of maritime risk travels far. Ships slow down, insurance premiums rise, energy prices respond, and in that underwriting room at Lloyd's, the old lutein bell still hangs, a reminder of the centuries when the fate of ships was announced with a single ring. It rarely sounds today, but the risks it once signalled have never truly disappeared. Marine insurance remains one of the quiet forces shaping global trade, and it's a subject we may return to in the future, perhaps with insights from our good friend Terry Conlon, who spent many years working in the marine insurance sector himself. Because while the nature of danger at sea may change, the question that has been echoed through Lloyd's for more than 300 years remains the same. Can the voyage be insured? And that ties us nicely into our next little segment here. And recently I spoke to Eddie Burke about the loss of a vessel called the Foxwell. And of course this would have been a vessel that Lloyd's would have recorded as being lost. And you'll hear at the end of the piece where I end up finding out a little bit more about the Foxwell. So here's myself talking to Eddie about that particular wreck off the South Wexford coast. You're very welcome back to Steady As She Goes, Eddie. How are you keeping?
Thank you.
So the Foxwell?
Well, the Foxwell was wrecked in Wexford. That's clear. But the location was a bit vague. One account says that it was the 29th of January 1809 and that it was wrecked on the Conningmore Rock off the Wexford coast. Now, more traditional sources say 1801 and that it struck a rock near Carnsore, which I suppose wouldn't be completely different. The story was that she was en route to Wexford with a cargo of cotton bales. The port that she left isn't described, but it has to be America because, as I say, there wouldn't be much cotton grown in Cork.
No.
One story says 27 men escaped onto Conningmore Rock, but were dismayed when they realised that it wasn't part of the coast, but a tide-washed pinnacle. They discovered that one of their number, Long Philip, was missing, and they lamented his loss. Then,
must have been a fairly big rock then.
Well, the Conningmore now is a fairly big rock. It's as big as a bus and a bit. But
handing off Carnsore, you'd have the barrels there, and then you'd have Black Rock, and so there wouldn't be a whole pile that size down there that they might confuse for the shoreline either, you know.
No, they're all pretty isolated rocks. Like in a storm, I suppose they wouldn't have known much about where they were, especially if they'd come all the way from America. Like ships were completely lost when they reached the coast, pre-radar days, and indeed in 1809, pre-lighthouse days. They were really sailing into a void, and it's remarkable
as well.
Well, that coast is dangerous, and there's, as I say, as you've just mentioned, there's a string of rocks off it. But even as late as 1900, steamers came across the Atlantic and ran straight into Mizen Head because they'd been taken a bit north of their intended course. And in the absence of radar and in fog when you couldn't see light signals or lighthouses, they hadn't a clue where they were. Yeah. And a bit of a wind or a bit of a set on the tide after a 2,000-mile journey, sure, you know, a fraction of a degree error on a compass was enough to drive them 50, 70 miles north of their course.
Absolutely.
And so back in 1809, they hadn't hardly a chance. They were hoping to strike the shore and recognize it.
Indeed, what became of these fellas then, Ed?
Well, one crew member was in a cabin when the ship broke, and his portion was kept afloat by the cotton bales and was washed ashore at the Burrow. And he was able to describe the circumstances of the wreck. And the crew were rescued from the Saltees the following day by Kilmore fishermen. So again, another bit of confusion is some thought that the wreck was on the Fundale Rock. That's a
Down
good
that's
distance away.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, yeah. And there's not a whole lot of the Fundale shows above low water. Even it's a wash most of the time.
That's true. Now, you see, they may have hung on to the cotton bales to be washed ashore. The whole story is a little bit convoluted and confused, like a lot of these things. The rudder of the ship was on display in Kehoe's pub in Kilmore Quay at one time. That, I think, used to be owned by Paddy Power. But then, you see, it was attributed to the Foxwell, but you begin to wonder, well, was it the Foxwell rudder or the rudder of another ship?
Yeah.
With so much doubt around the circumstances.
And the fact that they were rescued from the Saltese as well. Obviously, the cotton bales were makeshift life rafts, really, for them, because whichever rock they struck, to make their kind of escape or their safe route to the island would have certainly required some sort of flotation device anyway, and there wouldn't be a whole lot of flotation devices back in 1809. So wherever they were, these cotton bales almost certainly were their saviors.
Without a shadow of a doubt, though, mind you, they did very well in January water to hang on to cotton bales.
And they were landed
Like,
ashore then, I suppose, in Kilmore.
well, now that's not at all clear at all. If it was Kilmore fishermen, they surely went back to Kilmore. So
Yeah.
landed in Kilmore looks very likely.
Very interesting. She was a schooner.
I don't know what kind of ship she was. She must have been fairly big now if she was on the transatlantic trade, bringing
Yeah.
cotton from America. Not at all clear. Probably a schooner, all right.
And was there
Would have
any
been a good sized schooner, though.
Yeah, she would have been, yeah. And was there any evidence of the wreck itself afterwards, Ed? Did you find any of that documented?
No, no, apart from this business that the rudder was recovered, but I assume that had to have been washed ashore. You see, a wooden ship, if it hit a rock, would have been in bits in
Absolutely.
no time. Like there's very little trace. The most you'll find of some of these things will be a few copper nails, where timber
Absolutely.
sank to the bottom and was waterlogged and eventually literally dissolved.
Yeah, yeah. Any more information on the ship or the wreck itself then, Ed, that you've
No, it's a
seen?
bit of a mystery.
So that's one for the
Uh,
listeners, really, to put a shout out here. If anyone has any information or clarity on the Foxwell, number one, the year, we're probably more confident of the 1809 date. But that rudder in Kilmore, we might have to go and have a look at that and see if there's any more clarity connected to that, maybe.
well, unfortunately, see, these things that are kind of put up in a pub, they don't exactly do what the museum people would call provenance and name the man who found it and the date that it was found and put a catalogue number on it and all the rest of it. And a lot of this is kind of tedious academic stuff, but it's still, well, as they say, puts a bit of verisimilitude on a bald and unconvincing narrative.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Good stuff, but
It's
an interesting story nonetheless.
Well, an interesting story in that cotton was being brought into Wexford, if that indeed is true, because these trade patterns were interesting in that it showed, well, if it's true, it showed that there was some sort of cotton spinning and cotton processing and weaving industry in Wexford. And I don't know much about that either.
Mm,
You associate cotton processing with places like Manchester in England and the big cities of the big mills of the Liverpool, Manchester area,
yeah, yeah.
not Wexford itself. So that alone is a story that if bales of raw cotton were coming in from the southern states of America, that there must have been some sort of industry in Wexford.
Yeah, and that'd be very interesting to research that particular strand of the story. The other alternative, of course, is that they were so far off course that they ended up in Ireland instead of the UK.
Well, that's not far wrong. To tell you the truth, some of the details are probably ascertainable by going to the newspapers now. When I made some of these notes 30 years ago, electronic newspaper search wasn't easy. It wasn't possible. And you had to track down every incident one by one on tedious microfilm. And so it's the work of a couple of press buttons nowadays. And in addition, of course, then you can go to the Lloyd's list and you'd find out the home port of the Foxwell and the captain's name all electronically without virtual effort at all.
Indeed,
So
yeah.
there's a challenge to some of your readers now to research the story of the Foxwell.
Absolutely, yeah. We'll put the challenge out there, and I think some of our own members here might indeed jump on it. But that's right, ladies and gentlemen. If you have any information or any desire to go and search out the fate of the Foxwell and where she came from to where she was bound, we'd love to hear from you.
Now, following on from our recording with Ed on the Foxwell, I have gone away to do a little bit of research, and on a page of Lloyd's List printed in London on Tuesday the 7th of February 1809, 3 lines in the corner of the page down near the bottom says, "The Foxwell from Dominica to London was totally wrecked on the 29th of January near Wexford. Crew saved." So those 3 little lines give us an indication that she was indeed very, very far off course. She was bound to London and wrecked off the south corner of the Wexford coast there. It doesn't shed any further light on where exactly she was wrecked, but of course it does put to bed the theory that the cotton bales were bound for Wexford. Still plenty of answers required there on the particular story of the Foxwell, so if there is anyone out there, folks, who has any more information on where she was wrecked and further circumstances around the vessel, we'd be delighted to hear from you. And now it's time for our Maritime Words of the Week. For this week's Maritime Words, we are looking at a term that every seafarer knows very well: the bridge. This topic actually came about thanks to a listener request. One of our listeners got in touch to ask a simple but very good question. Why is the command centre of a ship called the bridge? It's one of those maritime terms we hear all the time, but many people have never stopped to think about where the name originally came from. Today, the bridge, of course, is the command centre of a ship, and it's where the captain and the officer on watch navigate the vessel, monitor radar and communications, and issue the orders that keep a ship safely on course and manoeuvred once in port. But to understand the origin of the word, we have to go back to the 19th century, when steam power began transforming ships at sea. Before steamships arrived, sailing vessels were generally commanded from the quarterdeck, near the stern of the ship, as you will have seen in photographs and movies. And this is where the wheel and steering gear were located, of course. From this position, the captain could observe the sails, the crew, and the ship's progress. There was no such thing as a bridge, as we know today. When paddle steamers then began appearing in the early and mid-1800s, ship design changed dramatically. These vessels were fitted with large paddle wheels mounted on each side of the hull, enclosed in structures known as paddle boxes. While the paddle wheels provided propulsion, they also created a problem. They obstructed the captain's view forward and along the sides of the ship. Shipbuilders solved this by constructing a raised platform that stretched from one paddle box to the other, allowing the captain and the officers to stand above the obstruction and see clearly ahead and to both sides of the vessel. Because this elevated platform literally bridged the gap between the paddle boxes, it began to be referred to simply as the bridge. From this position, the captain could oversee navigation, direct the ship more effectively, with a clear view of the vessel's course and the waters ahead. Even after paddle steamers disappeared and were replaced by ships with screw propellers, the term remained in use. The command position continued to be called a bridge, even though it no longer physically connected the two structures on the ship. Over time, the bridge itself evolved. The early open platform gradually became enclosed wheelhouses and navigating bridges, and as technology advanced, they were equipped with radar, electronic navigation systems, communications equipment, and integrated control systems. Today, on modern ships, the bridge is often described as the brain of the vessel, the place where navigation, communication, and command all come together. So the next time you hear someone say the captain is on the bridge, remember that the term dates back nearly 2 centuries to the early days of steamships, when a simple walkway between two paddle boxes gave the ship's officers the view they needed to safely guide their vessel at sea. And our thanks, of course, to the listener who sent in that question. If you have any maritime words you'd like us to explore, or perhaps an unusual nautical expression you've heard at sea, do send them in to us. We'd love to feature your suggestions in a future Maritime Words of the Week. Now, as we come to the end of this episode, you'll have noticed, of course, the evenings are beginning to stretch out again and the days are getting longer. There's still the odd reminder of winter in the weather from time to time, of course, but spring is certainly beginning to make its presence felt. And with that comes lots of activity around our coasts. Our ports are busy, ships are coming and going, and there always seems to be something new appearing on the horizon. So if you get the chance, take a stroll along your local harbour or shoreline and see what's happening. You never know what vessel might be calling in. And of course, if you're anywhere near Rosslare Harbour Maritime Heritage Centre, don't forget that we're open every Saturday and admission is free. We'd be absolutely delighted to see you there and have a chat about all things maritime. If you've been enjoying the podcast, of course, please like, subscribe and share the word. It's great to have everybody aboard, and there's always plenty of room for more on the crew list. You can also follow along and keep in touch through our social media channels, where we regularly share maritime news, stories, photographs and updates connected to the podcast. And of course, as I said, if you've any requests, interesting maritime stories, questions or unusual nautical expressions, please don't hesitate to send them in. We always enjoy hearing from listeners, and your messages often help shape our future episodes. And we've had some really fantastic content in from all around the coast. It's really fascinating to see the interest that's been generated and all the unusual stories that are coming our way. For now though, that's all from us. And as always, safe sailing and steady as she goes.